Washing her hands when she didn't realize that she was going to she moved the paper towels. I was like, suddenly she has the ice cloth out.
As we come together in community, we admit to one another that all is not right in our hearts and in our world. We look to the darkness sometimes more often than we look to the light. We look for what is broken and not for what is being mended. We look to criticize more than we look to praise. We look at ourselves and not to each other. May we be turned around that we may look at the possibility, at the hope, at the promise, at the grace, at the healing and love that this community brings. And now let us together light our candles of community. You can light a candle for a joy or a concern or simply to bring more light to our space.
The gift to be simple, the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in a place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed to turn. Turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round. The gift to be simple, the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in a place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. The gift to be seen, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to give, the gift to be seen, the gift to be free, to be free. 'Tis the gift to give, to be seen, to be free, to be free. 'Tis the gift to be free.
Let us stand in body or spirit for the lighting of the chalice and our spoken affirmation. With humility and courage born of our history, we are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community where all souls are welcome as blessings, and the human family lives whole and reconciled. With this vision in our hearts and minds, we light our chalice. Let us join in the spoken affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and freedom, and to help one another. You may be seated. Our opening thought comes from Mohandas Gandhi on humility that he wrote in 1940 in a newspaper that he helped to publish. It is unwise to be too sure of one's own wisdom. It is healthy to be reminded that the strongest might weaken and the wisest might err.
Amazing grace. sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to feel, and grace my fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that led me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me, His word my hope secures. Oh, He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Then when we first begun.
Our next reading is from Carl Sagan, from an interview from 1996. Every time I think of Carl Sagan, I think of my dad forcing me to watch every episode of Cosmos as a young boy, which I look back on and I'm very thankful for. Carl Sagan said in an interview in 1996 these words, "Who is more humble? The scientist who looks at the universe with an open mind and accepts whatever the universe has to teach us, or somebody who says everything in this book must be considered the literal truth and never mind the fallibility of all the human beings involved?" Let us prepare ourselves for a moment of meditation. Sit comfortably in our chairs. Take a few deep breaths before hearing the following words. Holy Spirit of life and love, you who are our source and our ultimate destiny, lead us this day on a crooked path. So often we are in so much of a hurry, taking the direct route to our goal, not allowing ourselves to be distracted, sometimes being too direct with one another in all that we seek to do, to be, and to have. But we can see that no river takes a direct path to the sea. The trees and bushes sprout crooked limbs, and birds, beasts, and insects meander in their search for food, shelter, or a mate. We lose so much when we take the direct route. The interstate which bypasses the quaint township, the arrow that misses the mark, the chance to stop and say hello and how are you, and really listen to the reply. So lead us on the crooked path, past wandering streams and crooked trees, following our heart's desire, not just duty's demands. For the crooked path also leads us home. Our next reading comes from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I have three precious things which I hold fast and prize. The first is gentleness. The second is frugality. The third is humility, which keeps me from putting myself before others. Be gentle, and you can be bold. Be frugal, and you can be liberal. Avoid putting yourself before others, and you can become a leader among persons.
Break not the circle of empowering love, where people grow forgiven and forgiving. Break not the circle, make it wider still, till it includes, embraces all the living. Come wonder at this love that comes to life, where words of freedom are with humor spoken, and people keep no score of wrong or guilt, but will that human bonds remain unbroken. Join then the movement of the love that frees, till people of whatever race or nation will truly be themselves, stand on their feet, see eye to eye with laughter and elation.
The myth of American exceptionalism and the myth of innate American goodness that comes with it are both incredibly damaging when it comes to bringing positive systemic change that will improve our society and make our society more just for all people. It leads us to cling to the illusion that we are number one in everything, when we clearly and demonstrably are not. The collectively self-delusional idea that we are exceptional as compared to all other countries and cultures in the world hinders us from cultivating the humility and the collective self-circumspection that are needed to recognize our shortcomings, to recognize our systemic shortcomings, and bring about positive social change. It keeps us from clearly seeing our shortcomings and correcting them in ways that are not just superficial, but rather are deep and lasting. If we could get over our American exceptionalism and the nonsense that comes with it, and have some intellectual humility, we would see how much we have to learn from other societies and from other cultures, and we might begin to make much needed improvements in the way that we live and function together. Rather than burying our heads in the sand of American exceptionalism, if the United States as a country had the intellectual humility required to become a truly good and truly great society, we would look at other countries as models for what we might be able to do in different areas of our lives together. We would look at countries like Sweden as a model for ecological sustainability. We would look to countries like Finland as a model for public education and as a model for overall quality of life and happiness. We would look to Norway as a model for a vibrant democracy and for freedom of the press. We would look to New Zealand as a model for anti-corruption, to the Netherlands as a model for religious freedom, the well-being of women, and racial equality. We'd look to Canada, just to our north, as a model for protecting and supporting LGBTQ+ rights. We would look to Iceland as a model for nonviolence. And we look to countries like South Korea as a model for healthcare. In one survey or another, or one study or another, all of the countries that I've mentioned were ranked number one in those areas that I mentioned. If we had an intellectual humility as a country, instead of saying we are simply the greatest country in the world, the greatest society in the world, we look to these other places as models to learn from. And there are many other places and many other countries that we can learn from as well. Imagine how much we could learn from these other societies if we look to them with an open mind and a willingness to learn from our mistakes and to learn from their successes, rather than clinging to views like those expressed by one cable news opinion host whose name I won't give, who once said, quote, "The U.S. is the greatest, best country God has ever given man on the face of the earth," end quote. It seems that many people believe if we say things like this, loud enough and proud enough, that no one will be able to contest that we are the best. We must ask ourselves, why do so many of us believe that the United States is the best country in the world when all of the evidence shows quite clearly that we are not? What are the roots of our lack of humility as a nation, as a society? I tend to agree with Jo Luhmann. She's the host of the podcast The Living Room, which I recommend to all of you. She sees our lack of humility as rooted in our history of colonialism and the colonial mind that has developed as a result of this history. She writes, "The colonial mind says, I don't understand this, therefore it is wrong, and then demands others to adapt to it. The liberated mind says, I don't understand this, I wonder what I can learn, and then adapts to others." It's a juxtaposition between shrinking versus expanding our minds. If we as a society want to be both good and great, then we will have to shake loose of the prideful colonial mindset that is at the core of American exceptionalism. If we want to become good and great as a society, we will need to humble ourselves and realize that greatness will not happen through the way so many of us are currently headed. Our greatness as a society will not come from the way of turning our backs on the immigrant and the refugee, the way of separating parents from their children, the way of not hearing those who have been harmed physically and emotionally, the way of increasing inequality between the rich and the poor, the way of increasing injustices against persons of color, the way of decreasing access to healing made possible by affordable and quality health care, the way of discriminating against those who orient themselves to religion differently than we do, the way of discriminating against our LGBTQ plus siblings, and the way of removing reproductive choice, or the way of increasing our exploitation and the harm of the earth. This is not the way to greatness. This is not the way to goodness for us. This is the way of hubris and hate, the way of injustice and oppression, the way that religious teachers like Jesus, who so many in our society claim to follow, would often simply refer to as sin. If we are to become good, compassionate, and just members of a beloved human community and a beloved ecological community, our greatness will come from the power of humility. It will come from the way of love of all of our neighbors and all our enemies, the way of humility as members of a common humanity and a shared ecological community, the way of working for justice with the poor and oppressed, the way of bringing affordable healing and care for all people, the way of welcoming the stranger and the refugee, the way of reuniting families instead of tearing them apart, the way of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, the way of providing homes for the homeless, the way of peacemaking and not hate-making and fear-making, the way of opening our hearts and our homes to people of different religions and no religion, the way of listening to and respecting women, the way in which the lives of people of color matter just as much as the lives of white people, the way of restorative justice, not just retributive justice, the way in which all persons are treated equally as persons of sacred worth, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and the way of repairing and regenerating the earth as we care for our ecological community. We must escape the hubris, the unwarranted pride of the colonial mind that attempts to force everyone to be like us, and instead embrace the humility of an open mind that seeks the very best ways to live and love together into beloved community. This past week, we were given some images that ought to remind us that humility is the proper response to the world and to the universe in which we live and move and have our being. I wish that Carl Sagan was still alive to have seen the images that we saw this past week that came out on July 11th and July 12th. July 12th was my dad's birthday. He turned 87. Remember the dad who made me watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos episodes when I was a child? He was so excited that some of the first images of the James Webb Space Telescope were coming out on his birthday. He was filled with awe and wonder as he saw the images come from this telescope that is multiple times more powerful than any previous telescope. And it reminded him and reminded me, and I think should remind all of us, I'm sure it would have reminded Carl Sagan, that there is an awesome wonder that we experience when we look at the universe. And it's also a reminder that we have so much to learn. We are so small in many ways. What we know about the world, the universe, and even about ourselves and our place within the universe is so little to what there is to be known. There's so much that we can know. There's so much that we can figure out about the world and the universe that can help us to understand ourselves better. And I'm hoping that those images might remind us to have not only humility in the face of the grandeur of the cosmos, but also to have humility in our finite lives of human community together, and thereby not squander our opportunity that we have during this finite life to bring more love and to bring more justice into our world. As we reflect on humility and our response to the world and to the human community of which we are a part, I'd like for us to hear and hopefully follow the wisdom of a great scientist and environmentalist, Rachel Carson. You may have heard of Rachel Carson. She wrote the famous book, Silent Spring, that showed that the DDT and some other pesticides were causing tremendous environmental damage and that we needed to move away from using them. She wrote this towards the end of her life. She said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for the destruction of our species. Wonder and humility are wholesome emotions, and they do not exist side by side with a lust for destruction." At this time, we have an opportunity for giving. You may bring your gifts to the table, and there are also opportunities to give online. Our closing thought comes from H. Jackson Brown Jr. from the book Life's Little Instruction Book. He writes, "Every person that you meet knows something you don't. Learn from them." Let us stand in body or spirit for the extinguishing of the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.